Welcome, everyone. I am Lisa Kaplowitz. I am the co-founder and executive director of the Rutgers Center for Women in Business and a finance professor here at Rutgers Business School. Today, we are going to talk about how to support the LGBTQI plus individuals in the workplace. We're going to learn how to support folks as leaders, as managers, as colleagues, and as friends. I am so excited to have here with me three folks, Heath Davis, Reshma Mongia, and Michelle Petrazzulo. I'm going to introduce them in a second. Stop sharing. And as I'm introducing them, I want you to answer a quick question before we begin. For those participants on here, do you consider yourself an ally or an advocate for the LGBTQI plus community? This is anonymous. We're not tracking any of this back to you. And also let you know, as we are talking, we have the live chat going, and we want this to be as interactive and engaging as possible. So as folks are filling this out, I'm going to start with all of you left to right on my screen. So first we have Reshma Mongia. She is the Assistant Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at Moody's. She is responsible for 35 plus global employee resource groups. And she is also on our employee resource group roundtable at the Center for Women in Business. She has a long career starting out at Morgan Stanley before joining Moody's, and she is a proud graduate of Rutgers University with a master's from NYU Stern. Welcome.
Thank you.
Next, we have Heath Davis. He is a professor of political science and the director of gender, sexuality, and women's studies at Temple University. His book, Beyond Trans, Does Gender Matter? Questions, why are we always asking, are you a boy or a girl? Why does it really matter what your gender is for certain reason? He consults on diversity inclusion with businesses, schools, nonprofits, and was appointed to the Mayor's Commission on LGBT Affairs in Philadelphia. His work has been featured in many prominent news outlets, which you have all heard of: CNN, BuzzFeed, Sports Illustrated, Washington Post, Christian Science Monitor, MSNBC, Sex Out Loud, etc. Welcome, Heath.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And last but not least, we have Michelle Petrazzulo. Michelle is a member of the International Board of ADP Pride, the LGBTQ Business Resource Group at ADP. She's also a member of the DEI Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion team and serves all 9 ADP's business resource groups. She's been working in the HR field for about 20 years and also authored a book, We're All Okay, a Millennials Treatise. She lives in New York with her husband and 2 kids. Thank you for being here, Michelle.
Thank you.
Here's a lay of the land. I think you can all see this, right? 94% of us consider ourselves allies or advocates for the LGBTQI community. And some of us are unsure, which is actually great, because hopefully this is a learning. And this is actually the first event that we're doing where we're really engaging academia in industry. And I think that thought leadership loop is really, really important. So I'm excited for all of us to begin here. So let's just start. Michelle, how are you? And tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do that I can't read in your bio.
Sure, I'm doing great. Thanks for asking. So the work that I do for ADP is to work with all 9 of our business resource groups to help to ensure that there's equity among the groups, that they have the tools that they need in order to be providing a value proposition to both the organization and to the associates, and to make sure that they're able to do the great work that they want to be doing to support associates and to support the communities that we as ADP serve as well. So we really have a big value proposition that we're bringing out for our business resource groups. As I said, we do have 9. I also serve on the board of ADP Pride, and I have been proudly doing so for a few years now as the communications lead at first, and now as the HR advocacy lead and membership lead. And at ADP Pride, we do lots of great things in service to our associates to help them to feel comfortable at work, to understand, what are the great benefits that they could take advantage of at ADP as associates who are LGBTQ+, as well as to educate allies on how they can be supportive of associates within the workplace, and also to teach back to the organization on how they can be supporting the associates that work for them and attracting great LGBTQ+ talent to the workplace. I also am bisexual, so I'm out at work, and ADP is the first place that I actually chose to be out at work because I spent a lot of my career wondering if it was really worth it to be out, but I'm happy to say now that I do feel that it is worth it to be out, and it's been a journey, but it's been a great one. So I also talk a lot about what it means for me to be out at work and to be openly bisexual, but in a straight passing relationship. So that's just an overview of some of the things that I'm doing.
Thank you. Thank you. And I just read a recent statistic. 1 in 4 LGBTQI+ individuals, employees, are not broadly out at work. So that means only 20% of the people can really feel like themselves in the office.
Yeah, and we see over and over again that those people are more likely to leave organizations. And what I've experienced personally, and what we talk about a lot, is people who are in the closet aren't feeling comfortable bringing their authentic selves to work. And what I'm experiencing, and what others experience too, is that if you're feeling like you're keeping a secret, you're not feeling like you can be fully yourself. You're not bringing your best work. You're spending time filtering out your personality and not spending that energy on doing great work, which you're probably really capable of doing. And it really has a big effect on your ability to deliver, to feel like you're an integrated part of the team. And so being out in the workplace for those who can and who feel comfortable doing so, it's a big deal. And I talk a lot about that. And for those who can, I encourage them to do so.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank ADP, another one of our proud sponsors of the Center for Women in Business, in addition to Moody's. Reshma, tell us a little bit about you and what you do.
Hi. Well, first, thanks for having me. I want to start by saying happy Pride Month and happy Friday. I oversee DE&I for the Americas at Moody's Corporation. So I'm responsible for making sure we follow best practices with inclusion and belonging. We really listen to our employees, and we set a really high bar for ourselves and hopefully for others. And I credited a great part to our employee-run business resource group. So we just rebranded this week as the Pride BRG. So we're joining ADP in that respect. So yeah, that's what my day-to-day looks like.
Thanks. And Heath, tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do.
Sure, absolutely. So following Reshma's shout out there, I would say happy Pride to everyone. And also that the pronouns that I use are he, him, and his. There's a lot to celebrate in Pride Month, but there's a lot of work to be done as well. And I'm really happy to be a part of this conversation as somebody who is in academia, but has a great interest in how what we do in academia can be translated into the real world and really made useful in different businesses and workplaces. So this is really a great opportunity for me as well to learn from people. As Lisa said, I am a professor of political science at Temple. I also direct this gender, sexuality, and women's studies program. And I do consulting on diversity and inclusion with a particular emphasis and interest in trans inclusion, and also encompassed within that is just greater attention to gender itself and gender identity. And one of the things that I do with companies and different organizations, and I can talk about it in more detail later, is to do something called a gender audit, where I really sit down with folks and we look at all the places where sex or gender crops up in their administrative policies. And there are some interesting surprises about where it pops up. And my real sort of emphasis and argument is that we would be better off with fewer gender policies. And I can talk about why that is, but they're often a source of discrimination, specifically for trans people and trans appearing people. So we can talk about that. That's an important kind of addition, so that I, as a binary trans man, do not encounter a lot of discrimination, actually, as I attempt, go and use restrooms in the public sphere and so on. However, people whose appearance and maybe voice may be more ambiguous in terms of gender do face a lot of discrimination. And so, so that emphasis, I think that focusing on trans and exclusion is a starting point, but then we start to see the ways in which what we think of as transgender discrimination is really a broader form of gender discrimination that affects a lot of people, and not just not just trans people. So yeah, and my current research project, I'm looking at the diversity and inclusion consulting industry, and looking at the history of this. How did we get to a place where we have folks like me and folks on the panel who are doing work specifically as kind of diversity professionals? And I think it's an interesting history that begins with Title VII and then has changed over the years. So that's kind of what I'm working on right now.
Super interesting. Thank you. And I know you're going to add a lot of insight as well. And we're the Center for Women in Business, right? But there are a lot of different intersections with identity besides just gender. And I think it's really important to question ourselves, why are we even asking about gender in the first place? Because what is the purpose of what we're trying to find from a biological standpoint, or is it how we identify? And one of our themes at the center is the intersectionality of other identities as well, be it race, be it sexuality, be it age, et cetera. But Heath, I'm going to ask you to keep your professor hat on for a second to educate us. There are a lot of letters, right? And there are a lot of terms, and not everybody knows what they all mean. And so I'd love it if you could spend a second, helping us define LGBTQI and the pluses along the way.
Sure. I think the most important thing for folks to keep in mind is that rather than spending a lot of energy and effort trying to get it right, I think the more important message that I would convey is to stay current and try to educate yourself on an ongoing basis, because the terminology, as the letters indicate, is ever evolving. And so it's changing over time. Take, for example, the term transgender. I feel like I've witnessed in the last, recent year or two, moving away from that to talk about just trans people, and that's a shift. And we should expect the language to change in the future as well. But just that, so the letters that we're using here today, LGBTQ, QI would be, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer or questioning, and intersex. And then when we add the plus, those are additional possibilities as well. And so you might see A included in this, and that would stand for either asexual or agender. Agender is not the same thing as non-binary. It's kind of a subset of non-binary gender identity. And asexual would refer to someone who self-identifies as maybe not having sexual feelings for other people or interested in those kinds of relationships. But anyway, I do think that, like the term gay itself has shifted in its meaning over time. This is like very interesting history to each of the letters, and Michelle talked a little bit about bisexual identity, and that's something that I feel gets left out a lot when we use this acronym. We don't really talk about that letter. It used to be that we didn't talk about the T. I think we're doing a better job of that as a society now. Intersex would refer to people who, there are many different intersex experiences and conditions. So basically refers to having sexual characteristics, internal or external, that do not neatly fit into the sex binary. And so, people who are intersex may identify with that label or not. And the same goes for the other letters and the experiences that they convey. I think the one thing that unites us all together is gender discrimination. If you think about the gay men who are most vulnerable to discrimination, on a day-to-day basis. It is typically femme gay men, and the same thing for lesbians who may be masculine presenting. And so I think that, you know, gender identity, discrimination, this idea that we should be in these two boxes of male or female, nothing in between. Intersex experience tells us that that's just not true, that there's more variation than we typically think. So so that's that. I just would say, yeah, don't worry too much about getting it right. Stay current, educate yourself. We can talk about that more today, and expect for the terminology to evolve as we go forward.
And then how does queer fit into all of this?
Mm-hmm.
For those folks that are unsure if they're allies or not, I think educating them on all the terminology is helpful.
Yeah. Queer is really interesting. I'm 50, so I'm old enough to remember, you know, when I was in college, for example, this was not a term that had a positive connotation to it.
Right. I'm the same age, and so I'm about the same age, and so I'm with you.
So it was used as an epithet and seen as denigrating. And it's one of those terms that was redeployed as a kind of an empowering kind of gesture. And so, and today, queer, from my understanding, and others can jump in, is more like it's like an umbrella term that encompasses maybe, so queer women, queer men, people who feel like they're bisexual or trans, kind of uniting the community in that way. But it is kind of a generational thing. And I think that there are folks that are our generation and maybe older that still may not be comfortable, or it might not feel like the best term to use for their own identities, which is why it's so important for people who want to be allies and advocates to ask questions, right, about how people want to, how they identify. It can be just a simple question, doesn't have to be a long conversation about it, but just asking folks how they identify and what term that they would like to use, I think is important.
And Michelle, I think this goes to you. You know, how important is it, and how often, I guess, should people ask, what is your identity? How relevant it is to your actual work product? And along those same lines, how do you want to be supported at work? What does that look like from your colleagues, from your managers? You know, you identify yourself as a bisexual woman, and you're a sample size of 1 right now, but you happen to be the sample size on the panel. You know, what does that support look like, and how much do you want folks to focus or not focus on that aspect?
Mm-hmm. So I think that when it comes to the terminology, I would love to tell people that it's okay to not be sure, and it's okay to ask clarifying questions, because I think it shows that you're attempting to understand people. And it's that attempt to understand that shows that you're attempting to engage people and to get that better level of understanding and being on the level with folks. For me, when I was a teenager and I was starting to understand what I was going through, I understood very well gay and straight and lesbian, but I had never heard the term bisexual before. And it was only when I saw a Newsweek cover story that had the word bisexual splashed across it that I said, wait a minute, there's a word for this? And then my understanding began to evolve. And now we hear terms like pansexual and omnisexual as umbrella terms, or I should say offshoot terms under bisexual, because our understanding of gender has evolved to walk away from a binary perspective. And even now in the bisexual community, we say that bisexual no longer means attraction to 2 genders, it means attraction to more than 1. So we've broadened that. So things are changing a lot, and to expect, I think, even those of us in the queer community, to demonstrate I'm using the queer term in the inclusive sense, we all have a hard time keeping up with a lot of the changes. So it's okay if you're not sure and to seek clarification. So engaging in that conversation is showing that you care. So please feel free to do that. And I would say in the workplace, knowing when to have that conversation is an important first step. You know, don't start right before we get into a big meeting where I'm about to have a presentation and then say like, hey, Michelle, aren't you bisexual? I'd love to talk to you about that, but maybe not at that moment. So knowing time and place is a great place to start. But, you know, invite me to have lunch and talk to me about, hey, can I ask you a few questions about your experience? Yes, I would love to share. Talking to people about their experiences is important because we get an opportunity to learn, but also recognize that not everybody cares to share those experiences. Maybe they're not in a place to share, and that's okay too. When it comes to allyship in the workplace, it looks different depending on who you are. And we talk about this a lot in ADP Pride. An ally might be someone who is out at the parade and waving flags and cheering, and that's great. Allyship can also be quiet. It can be learning. And when someone who is not yet an ally is asking questions of someone who is not a part of the queer community, you can be that person who has learned something and you can share that on. So then when they are interacting with someone who is a part of the LGBTQ community, they actually have knowledge that they didn't have to go ask someone who's a part of the community about. That actually makes a big difference as well. So allyship looks very different depending on who you are and what your comfort level is, and whatever it is that you're bringing to the table, that is something that we can appreciate. There's also, I think, a second level when it comes to support at the workplace. You know, showing up and being a part of that celebration and community, that's huge for us. But I think the next step is going from an ally to an accomplice and really being a part of taking inclusion into the conversation. So sure, we have people who are LGBTQ plus who are present in the workplace, but do we all have a seat at the table? When we get a chance to speak, are we heard? Are we acknowledged? Are folks talking over us or taking an idea and running away with it that we brought to the table? Making sure that everyone's getting included in that sense is an important next step in evolving what diversity and inclusion looks like in the workplace, and allies have a huge part to play in that.
Thank you.
And I'll build on what Michelle said, right? So give credit where credit is due. So the things that Michelle just said, acknowledging in a meeting, that's a very simple example. I just did it, how to show support for somebody's idea in a meeting. You can advocate for equality, for equity, for pay parity. That's a really big one in companies. And social justice, right, and inclusive policies. So when you start thinking about it, I just saw a question from the audience, what do the pronouns mean? I just updated my pronouns in Zoom. I don't know if everyone knew you could do that, but it shows solidarity with the trans community, for example, right? Because not everybody identifies with the same what others may perceive their pronouns to be, for example, or their identity to be. So that's a sign of support. I would say, you know, supporting people where they're experts. So calling on them to talk about what they're good at, right? To showcase their expertise, not have others make assumptions. Let me give you a few examples. She's more of a behind the scenes type. Or he may have family obligations. They may lack the experience or skills to lead this project. We hear these things, you know, sometimes at work, not making assumptions. I'll go back to, you know, what I just heard in the panel, asking the questions and don't assume, right? And keeping in mind also, folks from this particular community may have to come out in every single meeting. They may not be openly out to everybody, right? You may be out to some trusted few, and it can be a very stressful process. So every time you're giving a presentation, say you're meeting with a client, they may not know your identity. And I'll cite later, you know, later on, there's something called an iceberg model, where some of your attributes are visible and some are not. So your gender identity or sexual orientation may or may not be visible. So just keeping that in mind when you're trying to support colleagues. Yeah, thank you, Lisa. So you all can see this, but basically above what's called above the waterline, you may be able to hear somebody's voice, see their appearance, but you may not know what their gender is. You may not know their family status, or if they are part of a so-called traditional family, and what does that even mean anymore, because there may be no such thing. So that's just examples of how you can support folks in the workplace.
Can I just build on that? This is a great, I think, line of conversation. Responding to the comment in the chat about pronouns, I would just add too that by adding your pronouns to your email signature or on your Zoom box, it's a way, like it's a non-verbal kind of way of also conveying support and solidarity. And to the question about what is this? It's for people who perhaps might identify as trans or might be gender non-conforming or non-binary in terms of their gender identity, who are kind of compelled to have these conversations or ask questions, or there's mistakes made about their gender in the workplace. And this is a way of, I feel like a very effective way of constantly kind of reminding everyone that we all have gender pronouns, and by displaying them, it is a show of solidarity. It also benefits cases where, suppose somebody has an androgynous name. I have a lot of students now who are named Taylor. That was a big, I have ton of Taylors, lots of Baileys, lots of names that could be, men or women or non-binary. And so in those cases, it lets you know how to communicate in a respectful way with that individual in an email exchange, right? So it goes to this primary business goal, or really goal in general, of just treating people with dignity and respect. You don't want to kind of interfere with that process, offend somebody. Most of us don't want to offend people when it comes to these things, but you can make a mistake, and that mistake can mean that the person feels disrespected or not seen. And so I think that these things are all really important to think about. So I appreciated the person asking that question in the chat, because we see it more often, and then you might be wondering what's going on here, and we can chat about that here.
Thank you. And I identify as a sick gender woman, which means my identity is what my biological self is, and I'm in a heterosexual relationship. So when Michelle says straight passing, right, people assume I'm married to a guy. I'm straight, and I happen to be. But so I'm the proxy of one on this panel asking the questions. I probably would have checked unsure. I aspire to be an ally and an advocate, but I'm probably not as much one as I think I am. And I think that's a proxy for all of us to know that we can do better. So I'm going to ask some of these scary questions that folks might want to know but are afraid to ask. But the intentions of all of these are good questions, because we're here to learn and educate ourselves. So somebody had just asked if I identify as a heterosexual woman, do I list she, her, hers? And I just updated mine based on what Reshma did as well. And the answer to that, I believe, is yes. The question is, if I don't identify as, and it doesn't have to do with sexuality, right? It's just the identity, of how I perceive myself as opposed to the biology of what I was assigned. Is that correct?
Oh, I think that's right. And I think as far as the language goes, currently, at least, we often talk about the sex that you were, or that a person is assigned at birth. So
okay, sex that's assigned at birth,
yeah.
not biology.
Yeah, because that can connote different things. And I think one thing that comes up when we start talking about trans identities, still people are maybe curious about surgeries or hormone use. And I would say it's fine to be curious, though the internet is a great place for being curious and getting information. Those are questions that, and if you just stop and think about it, you wouldn't want somebody asking you questions about that at work. And you might not want people asking you about your marital status or your sexuality per se. But so thinking about how these identities may or may not be relevant in the workplace, and may or may not be relevant to your particular relationship with a coworker or a manager or a customer, I think is really, really important. Like thinking about the role, the goal, and the context. And that will guide you about your questions and so on. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for correcting me. I appreciate that. We've gotten a couple in as well, and want to add to these and tag on to them. What if you're still trying to figure out which pronouns you should use? And what if you don't identify as a he or a she? Do you use they, them? What if you're not even comfortable with they, them because grammatically it doesn't make sense inside your head, right? So what are we supposed to use? What's the best practice? Anybody can jump in.
I'll just say quickly. So one thing that you can do is, we have these gendered honorifics, that are used in customer service a lot, and the goal is to be respectful. And sometimes even in correspondence, whatever, like sir and things like this, or even like Ms. and Mr. I think that in a lot of cases, I personally think we can get rid of those honorifics.
Yeah, I don't like those because it makes me feel really old. Like when I was first called Mrs. Kaplowitz, I was like, that's my mother-in-law.
Yeah,
who I love, but that's not me.
Yeah, and it goes on. And it's only a matter of time before you think about like a server in a restaurant who's trying to their goal is just to treat patrons with respect and do their job effectively. It's only a matter, if they're using like sir and ma'am, it's only a matter of time before they make a mistake for a variety of reasons, right? And that mistake is going to be a moment when the opposite effect is happening. Now the person is offended and now you feel compelled to have this awkward conversation. So I think it's like de-emphasizing the gendered ways in which we refer to each other. And I mean, you can use somebody's first name, or you can, as sort of, instead of using gendered pronouns. And then we can talk about non-binary identities too, because that's a term that connotes different things as well to different people. Like Demi Lovato, who recently came out, the celebrity who came out as non-binary, in an interview talked about the reason why they are using they and them pronouns has to do with the restrictive connotations with the term woman and being a woman. And so that's one reason why a person could adopt they and them, to reject that, to try to expand that. But other people don't identify as both genders and maybe gender fluid. So that's another way of being non-binary. Or somebody could be agender and not want to have anything to do with gender labels at all. So it's a tremendous variety again.
And then Heath, you did something at the very beginning of this conversation that said, and the pronouns I use are he and him and his. When we go into a meeting in the workplace, right? And we're meeting people for the first time, do we do that? Is that a good practice? Do we do it selectively? Do we do it like, what should we be doing? Does it make people comfortable, or in some cases, does it make people uncomfortable, depending on who they are? And how do we even know?
Yeah, and I would love to hear what Reshma and Michelle have to say on this, because I think there's not a right or wrong or settled answer to this question. I think one way of thinking about it is that if I'm a cisgender person in a meeting and I offer my pronouns by way of introduction, that may create a space for others. On the flip side of that, I've also heard from folks who may be, for example, a masculine presenting woman who may or may not be queer, who does not identify as non-binary or trans, and might feel like the reason why we're going around here and everybody's saying their pronouns is because they're really looking at me and they want to know like what I am, so then the spotlight might be put on that individual, or what, so I think there are different opinions on it. I think the Zoom kind of box, putting your pronouns there, I think is a maybe less controversial way to do it, and maybe in terms of your email signatures, but it is true in terms of social interactions, conversational, that I think it's not a settled question. but I'm curious what other people think about
Reshma, what do you think? Reshma?
I agree. It's not a one size fits all, and it really depends on your comfort level and also the environment you're in, right? So you may be, like I mentioned, right? Say you're in a customer meeting and you might be in a more conservative country or part of the country, or you may not feel comfortable at that point in time, or you may feel, for example, it's a threat to your safety to disclose and in that moment. So that's kind of what I was going back to earlier, where folks often have to come out again and again in every meeting or interaction they have, and it can be a really nerve-wracking process. So I would say it's really up to individual preference. Our CEO now puts his pronouns in his Zoom box, so we have town halls, and he's embraced that, and he thinks it creates a more inclusive environment. Some folks may not feel that way, and it's really up to you. I see a number of questions, in the chat box about this. Asking someone their name is never a bad move. You don't have to use a pronoun, just like Heath was just saying, you don't have to do that, but everyone has a name, so you can use that. I actually find myself rewriting emails sometimes. If I don't know somebody's pronouns, I don't want to just say, she should get this back to us, because I don't know if she goes by she, or she goes by they, or by he. So I will just use their name. So those are some examples. I'd love to hear if Michelle has any thoughts as well.
Yeah, I was also thinking that I think there are some great non-gender specific ways to refer to people. And I think that this goes back to what Heath was saying earlier, that if we don't have to put gender into things, let's not. So often when I start a meeting, I'll say like, hi folks, or thanks everyone for joining, or hey party people, or ladies and gentle thems. There's great ways to refer to people that don't necessarily have to include gender, and we don't even have to make it a part of the conversation. And so we can just kind of take that awkwardness out of it. And, later on, if people want to share, they can have the opportunity to do that, or we don't have to. But I also think that some of the ways that we've talked about that include sharing pronouns that don't necessarily include affirmatively speaking about it at the moment, like putting it in on a business card or in an email signature and things of that nature, that I think helps to make the conversation a lot easier. And it starts, I think, when allies like myself, for example, put pronouns in places so that, it's not just the folks who are necessarily identifying as gender diverse are putting out their pronouns, it's everyone putting out their pronouns, so that it's not an unusual thing to see, it's a common thing for folks to do. So I think that's a good recommendation as well.
And I like that, Michelle. And look, you can do that because it's authentically you. You can say ladies and gentle them. I could probably do it too, but I can imagine a lot of people, that's not them, right? They can't do that in their voice. But I like that. I might borrow it because I can do it. I feel comfortable doing it as well. Last question on pronouns, and we spent a lot of time on this, which I actually think is really positive, because it means that folks are curious and they're asking, and that means we're all looking to learn, lifelong learning. That's why I'm in academia. I haven't even seen this, so I'm going to learn as well. Z, them, there, with an X, with a Z. What do those mean? How do you pronounce them? I might have mispronounced them. Anybody?
I believe it's pronounced zay, like a Z. But yeah, I think it goes back to, if you're spelling out, for example, women contains the word men. So some people use an X instead of
or a
Mr.
Y. When I was in college,
right.
It was a Y,
X
and I was like,
Y.
I don't know. I grew up in Arizona, and then I went to school in Providence, and I was like, where do you put the Y? Is it Y-many, womeny?
Right.
I didn't know.
There's no consensus. I think that was Heath's point earlier, right? There's no one set of rules or consensus, but it's really on what makes you comfortable, and there's not a universally adopted set at this point. But I have seen that in some applications. I applied for a library card when I moved, and I was delighted to see one of the options was MX, instead of Mr. or Ms. So it really goes to your personal preference.
I like that a lot.
I would also say that this is an area where if you're not needing to use this at this moment, don't stress it too much. It's good to be curious about it and to ask and to wonder. But if you come into a situation where somebody is utilizing those pronouns, that's a great opportunity to say, can you tell me the correct pronunciation of those pronouns so that you can make sure that you're doing the respectful thing? But don't stress it too much if you're not sure. I have also seen those, and through reading and research, I have yet to come across anyone who actually utilizes them in daily life though. So it's an interesting point, but if it's something that's causing you a little stress and you're not sure, don't stress about it too much until you need to use it. And then you can get clarification directly from the source.
That's great. And I like the idea of just using people's names. I think that clears up a
Yeah.
lot.
And to the person in the, I think Casey in the chat was asking, so should we ask our patrons their first name as a server? I don't think you have to do that, but just what Michelle was saying, I mean, you can say good evening, folks, or like, what, you know, what do you all, like, there are many different ways that you can refer to people, but also, I would say that, like, I've observed we're in a moment now that I think non-binary is a term that is coming into the mainstream more. And so they and them pronouns as gender neutral pronouns are something that we're seeing more just in the mainstream media. So, so just kind of keeping that in mind. And I think that that's all of these moments are interesting because the gender neutral terminology, the pronouns have a deep history, like in feminism, and like Reshma was saying, often pushing against the binary, which is not equal. So the fact that even the term woman includes the term man, and we know on so many different levels that it's not an equal kind of binary. So how do you try to push against that and bring equity as far as gender goes? I think is interesting, but I do think that we're at a moment where they and them pronouns are coming into the public sphere, and people should, you know, be paying attention to kind of what they mean and trying their best to respect people's wishes when they're saying this is how I identify. If you make a mistake, no problem, just quickly, you know, apologize and move on.
Absolutely. Okay, so Florence, thank you for that nice softball because that's exactly where I want to move. And I want to start with Reshma. How can companies use their diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, and you know, and then throw it to Michelle afterwards as well, and their BRGs, their business resource groups and employee resource groups, to support the community, the LGBTQI plus community, and what are some policies that these companies can put in place?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that question. I think part of it goes to developing talent, right? So you might have sponsorship programs in your company, which is different than a mentorship program. I'm sure you've all, you know, heard those terms in the past, but we also have reverse mentoring, right? So where senior execs can maybe learn from folks who are not like them in many different ways. Some of this does depend on a voluntary self-identification. So if you think back to that iceberg that I showed you, if I were from the LGBTQ community and I was straight presenting and I never said a word, people might not know. And I'm not openly out, right? So some depends on voluntary self-ID. So I think self-identification programs in companies where people can feel safe identifying are helpful because then you can have, you can solicit feedback from certain folks who have self-identified, listening to ideas on policies and benefits that may affect a particular group. So let me give an example. Our Pride BRG suggested the idea and they built an effective business case for surrogacy and adoption benefits, which we've since implemented. So just also to point out that doesn't just benefit the LGBTQ plus community, that benefits anybody who is in a family planning position. Same for trans-inclusive healthcare benefits, right, which we also have implemented at the company, thanks to feedback from a group of employees. Our women's BRGs suggested gender-neutral paid parental leave. So now fathers and adoptive parents also get 10 weeks in addition to existing paid time off or short-term disability that birth mothers might get. And two of our senior executives and executive sponsors are openly out, and they're members of a board of a nonprofit called Hetrick Martin Institute. So we also work with that group to engage in paying it forward. So we mentor at-risk LGBTQ plus youths. We help them prepare for employment. So you're actually then impacting the community outside of your walls. We have the program is called the Queer Coders Program. So that's very cool because we're we're a hybrid of a finance and a technology company. So we're able to kind of offer our skill set. A couple more things just off the top of my mind. In our intranet, we have a gender transition guide for managers and colleagues. So what does it mean if you're transitioning genders? I don't understand that term. Everything's laid out very nicely there. Creating gender neutral bathrooms. We have those in our offices, although it feels like an eternity since we've been in the office. But that's all contributed to kind of creating a more inclusive environment for employees, or so we hope.
I love all of that. And Michelle, what about ADP? What's ADP doing?
Yeah, I think that a lot of what Reshma said is great best practice. And I would add that this is where BRGs can really put the target audience in the driver's seat on driving a lot of that inclusivity. One of the great things that we've done at ADP Pride is we've created these posters. They're small and they say proud to be an advocate, and it includes some great design. And when I walked into the ADP offices for the first time and I was walking around and seeing everybody's offices and cubicles, there were tons of people who had the little poster either in their office or on their cubicle wall. And just seeing that there's a community of folks around that care about this, that want to affirmatively say that, hey, we're here and this is a place where you can feel comfortable, made a huge difference. When you walk into an office and you're LGBTQ+, you want to know, who are my allies? Who is my queer community here? And seeing that as an outward statement is a big deal. I also think that there's opportunities for education, both for folks within the community and allies of the community as well. Hearing from people who are having experiences within the workplace. We have often T-Track sessions and webinars where we get to hear from folks who represent all of the different stripes within the LGBTQ+ community. We also bring in intersectionality to it too, because it's not just that you are LGBTQ+, you might be LGBTQ+ and neurodiverse. We're finding out now that folks who identify as neurodiverse are far more likely to identify as gender diverse as well. And that's interesting emerging research. There's also a terrible situation going on right now for trans Black women specifically. What is the story behind that? Let's hear from some of those stories. Giving folks the platform to speak and showing that there are people who are there to listen and want to hear and share those stories, that creates an environment that shows that we're here to support you and that you're welcome here and you're included here. But I think it also goes back to values. At ADP, one of our values is each person counts, and that really does mean every single person. And when you live that value, it means that every person, no matter who they are, is bringing their authentic self to work, and they're encouraged to do so. And all of the policies that Reshma mentioned and all of the things that BRGs can bring to the table as well, combine to ensure that that workplace is actually living that value.
And so, Michelle, you touched on some. Oh, go ahead, Heath.
I was just going to add that I wondered what Reshma and what you all think about this. I think yesterday I read on LinkedIn that they were starting to pay, offer financial compensation, like $10,000 or something, to people who were leading these sorts of. Are you saying BRGs or ERGs?
I'm saying
either.
Yeah, I'm saying ERGs, but there are companies that call them ERGs, employee resource groups.
And there are companies like BMS who call them PBRGs, people and business resource groups.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, education goes both ways here. This is great. But that goes to this issue, and I feel like in the trans community in particular, and this impacts maybe trans folks of color more so. We're often asked to speak to these issues and do labor, right? Offer our stories and our time and our effort and without compensation. And so I thought this was a really interesting move that LinkedIn was making. And I wondered what others thought about that. This idea of companies compensating folks who may be doing this volunteer work, which is pretty labor intensive, to value it monetarily. I wonder what people think about that.
Yeah, I think that there's an interesting opportunity there to not only compensate people who are doing great work. I think that it's bringing a great deal of value, both, like I said, to the organization and to the associates. It's creating an environment that's feeling welcoming to this group of people. It's helping to bring talent into the organization. So there's a real value that's being driven for the organization and for associates. I think the other thing that we can take a look at in that regard is that what you see in ERG and BRG leaders is people who are taking on leadership positions who may not necessarily by title be leaders in an organization, but by passion and by interest are leaders and are demonstrating leadership value. And those are people who really are great resources for an organization, regardless of what BRG they happen to be a part of. And so I think that for an organization to recognize that value in so many different ways that are coming back, I think it's great to pay that back. So I think that that's an interesting development, and I'd be curious to see how it goes further.
I agree.
And look, as soon as I saw that, I posted something, our center posted something. Look, I'm a finance gal. And so what gets measured is what gets mattered. What gets valued is what gets paid for. So I think it sends a very, very positive sign that we think the value of these ERGs and BRGs and PBRGs is really important, not just to the well-being of our community of employees, a key stakeholder, but also valuable ultimately to our shareholders as another stakeholder, because it helps us improve our business. And we all know that a more diverse workforce actually helps that bottom line of profitability as well. So I thought it was an incredible, incredible thing. We have at the Center for Women in Business, Reshma's on it, ADP's part of it. We have 20 companies, I think it's more than 20 at this point, that are part of our roundtable. And if you're interested, by all means, email us at women@business.rutgers.edu and we can tell you more about it. But our corporate sponsors are part of this. And what we've really done is we're gathering these experts, all of you, to look at the ERGs as a business resource. I'm happy that they're finally getting paid for it. But not only is it a support group, because that's important, but it also can be great insight into how do we create change and policy within the organization. So my next question for you all, and really it's Michelle and Reshma, you know, I've read research that, you know, a lot of times women's ERGs, they're not so welcoming for, you know, the queer community, the gay community, the LGBTQ community. How can we do a better job? And by the way, what if I am a Black trans woman? I don't have time to go to 3 of these things. Like, how do we work together? And which one do I go to? How do we work together to support each other? Because ultimately, we all need allies and we all want to be treated equally and we all want to belong. So we stay at the workforce, which reduces turnover at the corporate level. How do we do it?
Yeah, I would just say quickly, you know, diversity is not one-dimensional, as you pointed out. So it's really, really important to engage multiple groups. One of the best practice we've been trying to do to kind of build allyship and build community and build togetherness, we're all in it together, right? We've been trying to encourage the BRGs to partner. So recently we had a bystander intervention hosted by Hollowback, and we had our multicultural BRG and our Pride BRG partner on that, on the Stop AAPI Hate initiative. And the Pride BRG has partnered with our mental health BRG, the impact of coming out on mental health. In the UK office, they also did impact of racism on mental health, right? So it's a very intersectional conversation. We have our 2 co-chairs for our veterans BRG are openly out, right? So we have some more intersection there. And I think it's really important to remember that you have the women in the women's networks who are part of all these communities, like you said, Lisa, right? So I'll invite Michelle to add anything at your company that you think has worked really well, but I think partnership is the name of the game here.
Yeah, Reshma, I agree. I think that there's opportunities across the board to be partnering across BRGs to be telling important stories. The Pride BRG participated in a cross-functional BRG conversation with Adelante, our Hispanic business resource group, as well as Cultivate, our African-American business resource group, to be having conversations about what that intersectionality looks like among our communities. Particularly within BRG for women, women are not unidimensional people. There are multifaceted people in a group of women, and they will represent so many different kinds of people. So there's so many interesting stories to be telling. And if we really want to get to the root of what women are going through, what supports they need, and what they need to be doing in order to succeed and to thrive, we need to be getting into some of those niches of what specifically is going on within that community. But I'll also add, if you only join one BRG as a part of an organization, it's the one that represents you, then you're missing out on such a huge opportunity to be learning about the people around you, and to, I would add, learn more about yourself, because there is a huge network of people around you that are intersecting among all of these different kinds of people. And you will have such an incredible experience if you join at least 2 BRGs and make sure that one does not necessarily represent who you are and what your background is. You will have such an incredible experience, and you will broaden your own horizons by doing so. I can't say enough about hearing from people who are different from you.
That is probably the best tip of this entire session. Thank you. Thank you for that. We are basically out of time, but wanted to ask resources for folks that want to learn more. What I've learned a lot personally on my allyship journey over the past year plus is we can't just always ask people, what should we do? What should we do? What should we do? We need to educate ourselves. We need to read. We need to watch. We need to learn. And so can you all recommend some resources, and we can send them afterwards as well when we send the video out to everyone, that folks can look at?
I just added to the chat also. I think the Trevor Project is a really wonderful resource. This is a nonprofit that provides a hotline for youth, LGBTQ youth. And we know that suicide and suicide ideation is higher among this group. But they also have all sorts of wonderful explainers, definitions, information. And I just recently checked it out and I found it really helpful. Also because it's generated by a focus on youth, I think it also gets to this idea of what's current and how can you become a welcoming environment to welcome people. So I think the Trevor Project is great. And also PBS is a good place for documentaries, and Pride Month in particular, to watch video and films about history and also the present moment.
Thank you. I just did a panel. I moderated a panel on Wednesday with the CEO of Abercrombie and Fitch. And they just partnered with the Trevor Project to produce a line for Pride Month, which was great. That's great.
I'll add in, ADP Pride has produced a series of videos on YouTube where we talk about a number of current issues in the workplace and supporting LGBTQ plus folks in the workplace. So you can go check those out and join your local LGBTQ plus BRG. You will find people there who are very excited to talk to you about their experiences. Those are great places to do a lot of learning.
Awesome. And Reshma, you just added a link for an event.
Yes, I just put a link for an event if you want to learn about microaggressions. There's one coming up from an organization we partner with. And probably Heath or Michelle are too modest, but they both have books. So I would encourage you to check those out. And I also love Jennifer Brown's How to Be an Inclusive Leader. So that's one that I go back to again and again. It really talks about your learning journey from to advocacy for any group you're supporting. And I think I would also encourage folks to check out Out Leadership and Stonewall and HRC, which is a human rights campaign. And if your company doesn't participate in their benchmarking surveys, I would encourage you to just check those out. It doesn't cost anything to participate, but you can learn a lot of best practices. So those are some I would recommend.
Thank you. Want to ask one final poll question. I know we're out, but As a result of this conversation, do you feel more equipped to be a better ally or advocate for the LGBTQI+ community? And at the same time, in the chat, tell us one takeaway that you learned. We're always looking to give as much info and insight as we possibly can, and anything else you'd like us to do. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all for participating. Thank you, Heath. Thank you, Reshma. Thank you, Michelle. Amazing comments coming out of all of this. Happy Pride Month to everyone. Any parting thoughts from the panelists?
This was a great conversation, and it's a learning process for all of us. So I feel like I gained a tremendous amount just by listening. So thank you.
Yes, big thank you to everyone.
Yes, thank you for having me. Great conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Have a happy weekend. Stay safe and be well.
Bye.